The red ink was the first thing I saw when I turned the page, a tight circle around the third paragraph of my final exam, and beneath it, in handwriting so small I had to angle the page toward the light to read it, 4 words that made my stomach drop. Come see me, tonight. Do not email me. No signature, no initials. Just Elara Voss's precise, slanted hand. The same hand that had crossed out half the class's arguments about operant conditioning with a single decisive stroke. I sat in the third-floor stairwell of the psychology building, my exam still warm from the printer tray outside her office, and read the sentence 4 times as if repetition might change its meaning into something less alarming. My first thought was plagiarism. It is always plagiarism when you are a scholarship student with everything to lose. I ran through the paragraph in my head, the one she'd circled. Something about informed consent operating as a performance rather than a genuine transfer of understanding between researcher and subject. I had written it in 20 minutes at the end of a 3-hour exam, half delirious with exhaustion, and I hadn't thought about where the idea came from until right now, sitting on a cold step with my heart trying to climb out of my throat. I had heard that idea before. Not read it, heard it, spoken aloud in our kitchen when I was maybe 11 years old. My mother pacing between the stove and the table with a legal pad in her hand, talking to no one, because I was the only one home and she thought I wasn't listening. Consent isn't a signature, Rowan. It's a performance. People sign because they believe they understand, and the researcher's job is to make sure that belief is true, not just convenient. I had never seen that phrased anywhere in the literature, not in 3 years of undergraduate coursework. Not in the assigned readings for Professor Graves's Advanced Behavioral Ethics seminar. Not anywhere except my mother's mouth in a kitchen that didn't exist anymore because we'd sold the house 4 years before she died. I should have been thinking about how to defend myself. Instead, I was thinking about my mother's handwriting, and how much smaller Elara Voss's was, and how strange it was that both women wrote as if they were afraid of taking up too much space. I texted Priya from the stairwell. Ta wrote something insane on my exam. Might be getting expelled tonight. Advice welcome, she wrote back in under a minute. What did she write? I sent a photo of the note. 3 dots appeared and disappeared twice before she finally answered. Rowan, that is not an accusation. That is a Tuesday night booty call, disguised as institutional intimidation. Are you going? I don't know if I'm being accused of cheating or asked on a date, and I genuinely cannot tell which terrifies me more. I wrote back. Which was true, though not for the reasons Priya would assume. I went. Of course I went. My scholarship required a minimum GPA I couldn't afford to gamble with a no-show, and beneath the fear was something else. Something curious and reckless that had been circling Elara Voss since the first week of the semester, when she'd stood at the front of the seminar room correcting Professor Graves's own citation in front of 40 students without raising her voice, and Graves had simply nodded and moved on, as if losing that exchange cost her nothing at all. The storm had been building all afternoon, and by the time I crossed the quad toward the psychology building, the sky had gone the color of a healing bruise, and the wind was doing something ugly to the trees along the east walk. The building's front doors were still unlocked for late study hours, but the lobby was empty, the vending machines humming to themselves, and half the overhead lights along the third-floor corridor were dark, which I told myself was probably just the storm affecting the grid, and not anything more deliberate. Elara's office door stood a few inches open, warm lamplight spilling out into the dim hallway instead of the usual fluorescent wash. I knocked once, softly, and her voice came back immediately, low. "Close the door behind you?" I stepped inside. The office looked different than it had during her posted hours, when I'd come by twice to argue about margin notes on earlier papers. The overhead light was off entirely. Only her desk lamp and a smaller reading lamp near the window were lit, throwing long shadows across the bookshelves. Rain had started to hit the glass in earnest, a steady percussion that made the room feel smaller, more sealed off from the rest of the building. Elara crossed the room past me and turned the lock herself, and the small metallic click of it went through me like a current. "You're not being accused of misconduct," she said, before I could ask. Before I could even form the question properly. Not by me, and not yet by anyone else, though I need you to understand how close we may be to that, depending on what you tell me in the next few minutes. That's a strange way to make someone feel less afraid. "I'm not attempting to make you feel less afraid," she said. "I need you honest, and fear is occasionally useful for honesty. Sit down." I sat in the chair across from her desk, the same chair I'd sat in twice before to dispute a grading decision. Except this time, she didn't sit behind the desk. She pulled the second chair around so we were facing each other at an angle, close enough that I could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the kind that come from squinting at other people's poor arguments for years. "The paragraph I circled," she said. "Where did the language come from?" "I wrote it during the exam." "I didn't ask if you wrote it. I asked where the language originated. The specific framing of consent as a performative act contingent on genuine comprehension rather than formal agreement. That is not classroom language. It does not appear in any assigned text, in any published behavioral ethics literature that I am aware of, and I have read considerably more of that literature than you have." My mouth had gone dry. Why does it matter where I heard it? "Because," she said, and here her voice dropped further, quieter, like she was aware of how thin the walls were, even with the storm covering most sounds. "Identical language, nearly word for word, appears in private research materials belonging to Professor Graves. Materials that are not published. Materials I should not have seen, and that you, as an incoming graduate student, with no departmental clearance, absolutely should not know exist." The room seemed to tilt slightly. "My mother," I said, before I'd decided to say it. "My mother used to talk like that, about consent being a performance. She said it to me when I was a kid. She was a researcher." Elara went very still. "Your mother's name?" "Celia Mercer." I watched something shift behind her eyes, a recalculation happening almost too fast to see, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its careful control. "Dr. Celia Mercer, who published 2 papers on behavioral consent frameworks in the early 2000s and then disappeared from the literature entirely after an academic misconduct allegation." "She didn't disappear," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I meant it to. "She was pushed. She spent the rest of her career unable to get funding, unable to get taken seriously, and she died still trying to write a rebuttal that no journal would publish, so forgive me if I don't love the framing." "I'm not attacking her," Elara said. "I am telling you that the language your mother apparently used at your kitchen table appears, nearly verbatim, in a locked file on Professor Graves's private drive, dated 11 years after your mother's misconduct allegation, in a document Graves has never submitted anywhere but keeps, because it forms the theoretical spine of the framework she is famous for." I sat with that for a long moment, rain hammering the window, my hands gone cold in my lap. "You're saying she stole it?" "I am saying the evidence available to me is suggestive, not conclusive, and that I have spent 4 years collecting fragments I cannot yet assemble into anything I could bring forward without ending my own career, and quite possibly yours." She leaned back slightly. "I wrote that note on your exam because I could not risk sending you an email that anyone in this department might read, and because when I saw that paragraph, written by a woman with your surname, in a class taught under Lenora Graves, I needed to know immediately whether it was coincidence. And now you know it isn't." "Now I know it isn't," she agreed, "which is considerably more dangerous for both of us than I would like." I studied her face in the low lamplight, trying to separate the woman my classmates called cold, unreachable, merciless with a red pen, from the woman in front of me now, who had locked a door against a building she clearly didn't trust and was choosing, for reasons I didn't yet understand, to hand a stranger a secret that could end her doctorate. "Why tell me any of this?" I said. "You could have just given me a warning to be careful with my language and let it go." "Because you are not going to let it go," she said, with the first hint of something almost like dry humor. "I've read your papers for a semester, Ms. Mercer. You do not let things go. And because if your mother's research was taken, you deserve to know it before you spend 2 years being trained by the woman who may have taken it." Before we return to the story, I just want to share a quick note. This version is made for YouTube, but the uncensored GL scenes and hotter videos will be available on my Patreon. Some moments are too spicy to include here, so if you want the fuller and bolder version, you can find the details in the description below. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere over the quad, and the office lights flickered once, threatening the storm's full intentions. Elara didn't flinch. I got the impression very little made her flinch, which made the tightness around her eyes now all the more visible for its rarity. "What do you actually have?" I asked. "You said fragments." "Photographs of 2 archived pages I was never meant to see, taken during an authorized filing task I was assigned 3 years ago. A partial audio recording from a faculty meeting where Graves discussed protecting her framework from, and I quote, unnecessary historical footnotes. And now, apparently, a living witness who can confirm the language predates Graves's publication by over a decade." She said it without triumph, more like she was listing the contents of a wound. None of it, alone, proves misconduct. Together, it might, but together also requires trust. I have had no reason to extend to anyone in this building in 4 years. And you're extending it to me. "I am considering it," she said, "which is not the same thing, and which you should not mistake for something warmer than it is." I almost laughed, despite everything. "You wrote 'come see me' on my exam and locked the door behind me. I think we're past pretending this is purely professional." Something flickered across her face, gone before I could name it. "This is exactly the kind of statement that will get us both removed from this program if either of us is careless. I need you to understand the stakes before anything else happens between us, romantic or otherwise. If Graves discovers we are investigating her, she has more power in this university than either of us combined, and she will use it. So why risk it at all?" Elara was quiet for a moment, looking not at me, but at the rain-streaked window, at her own faint reflection ghosted over the dark glass. "Because I have spent 4 years watching her rewrite the truth to suit her comfort, and I am tired of being complicit through silence. And because," she added, quieter, "I recognized the handwriting on your exam, long before I circled anything. I have been reading your papers since September, wondering if the person who wrote them was as sharp in conversation as she is on the page. I did not expect the answer to arrive with your mother's name attached." The rain didn't let up, and neither of us moved to leave, though we both understood, without saying so, that the conversation had gone as far as it safely could that night. Before I left, Elara gave me a folder, unmarked, containing photocopies of 2 pages from her fragmented evidence, and told me not to bring it to campus again after tonight. Where should I keep it then? Somewhere Graves would never think to look, somewhere that has nothing to do with this university. I thought of my mother's notebooks, still boxed in my apartment closet, 4 years unopened because I hadn't been able to face them. "I think I know a place." Elara studied me for a long moment before she nodded, as if she'd decided something. "Come back Thursday, same time. Do not tell your friends the specifics, even the ones you trust. Priya already knows you wrote something suspicious on my exam." "Then tell her it was a warning about citation formatting," Elara said, and for the first time that night, the corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but its shy and reluctant cousin. Thursday arrived heavy, with the kind of anticipation that made the intervening 2 days feel unbearably long. Priya cornered me in the library between classes, sliding into the seat across from me, with the particular look she gets when she's decided a conversation is happening whether I want it to or not. "You've been weird since Monday," she said. "Weirder than normal exam anxiety weird. What did Voss actually say to you in that office?" I hesitated, turning my pen over in my fingers. "She thinks my mother's research was taken. By Graves." Priya's eyebrows went up. "That's not a small thing to just casually mention over library coffee, Rowan." "I know." "Do you believe her?" I thought about the paragraph in red ink, about my mother's voice in a kitchen that no longer existed, about the particular exhaustion in Elara's face when she'd said, "I am tired of being complicit through silence." "Yes," I said. "God help me, I do." And the note. "Come see me, don't email me. That wasn't just about research." "No," I admitted. "It wasn't just about research." Priya studied me with the patient, assessing look she reserves for moments when she thinks I'm about to do something reckless, and wants to make sure I know she noticed. "Rowan, she's your TA. If this goes sideways, you lose your scholarship and she loses her doctorate. Please tell me you've thought about that." "I've thought about nothing else," I said, which was mostly true. That night I went through my mother's notebooks for the first time in 4 years, spreading them across my small kitchen table under a lamp that buzzed faintly when the refrigerator kicked on. Her handwriting filled page after page, dense and slanted, full of half-finished theories and margin arguments with herself. Halfway through the third notebook I found it, an early draft, dated years before her misconduct allegation, containing a paragraph about consent as performance that was, but for a handful of words, identical to the language circled in red on my exam. I photographed the page and sent it to Elara with a single line. Found it. She wrote it 11 years before the date on Graves's file. Elara's response came within minutes. Do not send anything else through this number. I'll explain Thursday. We met that Thursday not in her office, which she said now felt too exposed, but in the underground archive beneath the psychology building, a low-ceilinged room lined with filing cabinets that smelled of dust and old paper, accessible through a service door Elara had a key to from her cataloging work. She'd brought a small lamp, rather than turning on the overheads, and we sat on the floor between two rows of cabinets going through boxes of decommissioned faculty records, while she explained, in a hushed voice, exactly how dangerous the ground beneath us had become. Graves has noticed I've been distracted, she said. She asked me yesterday, very casually, whether I'd been reviewing old archive material. I told her I was organizing files for a departmental audit. I don't think she believed me. What happens if she finds out what we're doing? She destroys the evidence, discredits me professionally before I can publish anything, and ensures your scholarship committee hears whatever story she chooses to tell them about your mother's history. Elara said this without drama, simply stating facts she had clearly turned over many times already. Which is why we need more than fragments. We need something undeniable. We worked for hours that night, comparing dated documents, cross-referencing publication timelines, building a timeline of exactly when Graves's celebrated framework had begun appearing in her lectures, relative to when my mother's unpublished materials would have crossed her desk during a departmental review Celia had once mentioned in an old email I still had saved. At some point, my hand, reaching for a box on a low shelf, caught the corner of the metal and opened a shallow cut across my palm. Elara noticed before I did, taking my hand in both of hers with a gentleness that felt startlingly at odds with the composed authority she'd worn like armor since September. Hold still, she said, and produced a small first aid kit from her bag. The kind of preparedness I was beginning to understand was entirely characteristic of her. Her fingers were careful, unhurried, pressing a clean cloth to the cut before wrapping it properly. And the whole time she didn't look up at my face, as if concentrating on the task was the only way she could allow herself to be this close to me without saying something she wasn't ready to say. You're very good at this, I said, mostly to fill the silence, because the silence was doing something to my pulse I didn't trust myself to name aloud. My mother was a nurse, Elara said. I learned early that competence is a kind of safety. If you're skilled enough at something, no one questions why you're doing it. She finished the wrap and set my hand down gently, but didn't release it immediately, her thumb resting for 1 extra second against my knuckles before she pulled away entirely. We didn't find our undeniable proof that night, but we found enough to know where to look next. A lakeside research retreat, where Graves had reportedly finalized her framework 9 years earlier, in a private lodge the university still owned and occasionally rented for faculty conferences. Elara believed records from that retreat, if they still existed, would show precisely when Graves had access to Celia's unpublished materials. Over the following weeks, our investigation became something like a rhythm neither of us named directly. We met in the 24-hour library on nights before her office hours, hunched over the same table in the far corner where no one else studied, passing pages back and forth in a silence that had stopped feeling tense and started feeling companionable in ways that unsettled me more than the tension had. I learned things about Elara that no one in the seminar would have guessed. She annotated the margins of dense statistics textbooks with lines of poetry, tiny and private, as if she needed somewhere to put the parts of herself the department had no use for. She took her coffee black except on days she hadn't slept, when she added an absurd amount of sugar, and refused to discuss it. She removed her glasses only when she was exhausted past the point of maintaining her usual precision, and I began, without meaning to, cataloging the moments she did it the way I catalog everything when I'm anxious, or attracted, or both. At a crowded departmental conference in October, I watched a second-year doctoral student named Marcus, lean far too close to me at the reception, complimenting a paper I'd presented with more enthusiasm than the paper warranted, and I watched, from the corner of my eye, Elara's jaw tighten from across the room before she turned deliberately away. "You looked like you wanted to set something on fire," I told her later, once we'd both escaped to the quieter end of the hall. "I don't know what you mean." "Elara." I was reviewing his presentation slides in my head. They were mediocre. "That's not what your face was doing." She was quiet for a moment, looking somewhere past my shoulder. "It isn't appropriate for me to have opinions about who you speak to at conferences." "That's not a denial." "No," she admitted, so softly I almost missed it under the noise of the reception. "It isn't." By November, we had traveled together to interview one of my mother's former colleagues, a retired researcher named Dr. Whitfield, living 2 hours outside the city, and a booking error at the small inn near the train station left us with a single narrow room instead of the 2 Elara had reserved. Neither of us suggested driving back that night, though the storm outside made the decision for us regardless. We lay in the dark on opposite edges of the same bed, close enough that I could hear her breathing change when she thought I'd already fallen asleep. And at some point during the night I woke to find her coat draped over me, though I never asked when she'd done it, and she never mentioned it either. Dr. Whitfield, it turned out, remembered my mother's unpublished consent framework clearly, remembered discussing it with her over coffee in the exact years before her misconduct allegation, and agreed, cautiously, to provide a signed statement confirming the timeline. It was the first piece of evidence that existed outside Elara's fragmented archive, the first thing that couldn't simply be dismissed as circumstantial. "We're close," Elara said on the train home, her hand resting near mine on the small pull-down table between our seats, not quite touching. "Closer than I've been in 4 years. Why does that sound like you're more afraid, not less?" "Because the closer we get, the more dangerous this becomes for both of us. Graves has survived worse threats than this. I don't know what she becomes when she's actually cornered." I moved my hand the last inch to cover hers, and she let me, her fingers turning slowly to lace through mine, and for a long moment neither of us spoke, the train rattling steadily through the dark countryside, while something unspoken settled more firmly into place between us. There was a formal faculty reception in early October that neither of us could avoid, held in the marble atrium of the Humanities Building, all crystal glassware and forced conversation, and I spent most of it standing near a pillar, watching Elara move through the room in a dark green dress I had never seen her wear, greeting senior faculty with the same measured composure she brought to grading, giving away nothing. Professor Graves found me near the drinks table, her smile as polished as the marble beneath us. "Ms. Mercer, I understand you've been spending considerable time with my teaching assistant lately. Some sort of research collaboration, I'm told." "She's been generous with feedback on my thesis proposal," I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "How fortunate for you. Elara doesn't extend that kind of generosity often. I've always found her rather difficult to read, myself, though I suppose after 4 years I should have some insight into what motivates her." Graves studied me with an attention that felt suddenly clinical, as if I were a variable she was trying to isolate. "Your mother was rather like that too, if I recall. Difficult to read, convinced her own instincts were more reliable than institutional caution. It rarely serves people well." "I didn't realize you remembered her so specifically." "I remember everyone whose work crosses my desk, Ms. Mercer," Graves said, and there was something underneath the pleasant tone that made the back of my neck go cold. "It's part of what makes me good at what I do." She moved on before I could answer, and across the room I caught Elara's eye, watched her register, in an instant, that something had passed between Graves and me that required her attention. She excused herself from her conversation and crossed to where I stood, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. Not quite casual. "What did she say to you?" "She's fishing. She knows something is happening. She just doesn't know what yet." "Then we need to be more careful than we have been." Elara's jaw was tight, her eyes scanning the room the way I imagined she scanned a dense paragraph for a hidden flaw. "I don't like that she approached you directly. It means she considers you a variable worth pressuring, rather than an obstacle to route around." "Is that supposed to be reassuring?" "No," she said. "It's supposed to be honest." Her hand brushed mine, briefly, beneath the cover of the crowded room, and it was such a small gesture, and yet it steadied something in my chest that had been unsteady since Graves walked away. We left separately that night, an hour apart, out of habit and caution, more than any real belief it would fool anyone paying close attention, and I walked home through the cold October air replaying the conversation, unable to shake the feeling that Graves had been testing a hypothesis rather than making conversation, and that whatever she'd concluded, we were now further along her radar than either of us wanted to be. It was 2 weeks later that Elara brought me. After hours and with considerable nervousness she tried and failed to hide, into an old behavioral observation room in the psychology building's east wing, long since decommissioned, its one-way glass still intact, looking into an empty room once used for observing subjects who never knew they were being watched. "I used to come here to think," she said, running her fingers along the frame of the glass. "When Graves' expectations became too loud in my head, I would sit in here, on this side of the glass, and remind myself that observation isn't the same as understanding. She thinks she understands everyone, because she has always been the one doing the watching. She has never once considered what it costs to be the one being watched. Is that what this is? You showing me where you go to remember who you are outside of her?" Something like that. She turned to face me fully, the dim security lighting casting soft shadows across her face. "I wanted you to see this room because I think it explains something about why I've been so slow to trust what's happening between us. I have spent years being the one who watches, who catalogs, who stays one step removed so that nothing can be used against me. Being truly seen by someone feels like handing them a weapon. I don't want a weapon, Elara. I just want you." She reached out and touched my face then, slow and deliberate, her thumb tracing my cheekbone with a tenderness that made my breath catch every time, no matter how many times she'd done it before. "I am beginning to believe that," she said quietly. "It terrifies me exactly as much as it should." We stood there a long while, on the wrong side of the one-way glass for once, being seen by no one but each other, and when she finally kissed me it was slow and unhurried, her hands framing my face like she was trying to memorize something she was afraid of losing. By the following month, our investigation had led us to the Lakeside Research Retreat 2 hours north of the city, a converted lodge the university still used for small faculty conferences, where Elara believed records from Graves's original 9-year-old retreat might still exist in the property's archived guest logs and equipment reservation forms. We arrived under the pretense of a legitimate departmental research trip, Elara having quietly arranged access through a colleague who owed her a favor and asked no questions. The lodge was beautiful, in a way that felt almost cruel, given what we were there to do. All exposed timber beams and a wide lake visible from nearly every window, autumn color blazing across the far shore. We spent the first day going through the property's records room, a converted study lined with filing cabinets far less organized than the university archive, dust thick on ledgers no one had opened in years. "Here," Elara said, late in the afternoon, her voice tight with something between triumph and dread. She held up an equipment reservation form dated the same week Graves had reportedly finalized her framework, showing a private research pod booked under Graves's name, and beneath it, in a different, smaller hand, a note indicating shared use with a visiting researcher whose credentials were never filled in, only initials. "CM. That's her," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "That's my mother." It's evidence that they were physically together, in the same space, at the exact time Graves claims to have developed the framework independently. Elara's hands were shaking slightly as she photographed the page. "It isn't everything, but it's the strongest thread yet." That night, exhausted and wrung out from the weight of what we'd found, we sat together on the lodge's back porch overlooking the dark lake, wrapped in the same blanket against the growing cold, and for the first time in weeks neither of us spoke about Graves or evidence or timelines at all. "Can I ask you something that has nothing to do with any of this?" I said. "Always. What did you want to be, before all of it? Before Graves? Before the doctorate? Before any of this became about proving something to people who never deserved your effort in the first place?" Elara was quiet for a long moment, watching the water. I wanted to understand why people believed the things they believed. not to manipulate it, the way she does, just to understand it. I think I forgot that somewhere along the way, buried under trying to survive her long enough to finish what I started. You haven't forgotten it. You're doing it right now, with me. She turned to look at me then, something unguarded moving across her face in the low porch light. I think that might be the kindest thing anyone has said to me in longer than I can remember. I kissed her slowly under the wide autumn sky, and later that night, back in the small room with its single window looking out over the black water, we didn't discuss graves at all, only each other, and it was tender in a way that had nothing to do with archives or evidence, and everything to do with two people finally letting themselves be still together. Our first real argument came the following week, in the greenhouse behind the biology building, where Elara had suggested we meet, because Graves rarely set foot in a place that smelled of soil and required patience she'd never had. We'd gone there after discovering that university security had flagged Elara's keycard for unusual after-hours access, a discovery that had left her tense and clipped in a way I hadn't seen since our first meeting. "You should stop coming with me to the archive," she said, without preamble, as soon as we were alone among the ferns and the humid, dripping quiet. "Excuse me? Security is watching my access logs. If they connect you to my movements, your scholarship committee will hear about it before we have enough evidence to protect you. I think it's safer if I continue alone. You don't get to make that decision for me." "I'm not making a decision for you. I'm protecting you from a risk you may not fully understand." "That's exactly the same thing Graves does," I said, and I watched the words land somewhere behind her eyes, sharper than I'd intended, though I didn't take them back. "She decides what people can handle. She decides what truth they're allowed to have. If you cut me out of this because you've decided I can't handle the consequences, you're doing the same thing to me that she did to my mother." Elara went very still, the kind of stillness that meant the comparison had actually wounded her. "That is not a fair comparison." "Maybe not, but it's not an unfair one either." The rain outside intensified, drumming against the glass ceiling of the greenhouse, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. The humid air thick between us, heavy with everything neither of us had said yet. "I have spent my entire career being protected by people who decided, without consulting me, what I could and couldn't survive," Elara said finally, her voice low and rougher than usual. "My advisor before Graves withheld an authorship credit from me because he decided I wasn't ready for the exposure. Graves has done the same thing in smaller ways for 4 years, always under the guise of protecting my career. I did not realize until just now that I had started doing the exact same thing to you. I don't need you to protect me from the truth, Elara. I need you to trust me with it." "I do trust you," she said, and there was something raw in it now, something that had cracked open. "I trust you more than I have trusted anyone in longer than I can comfortably admit. That is precisely the problem. I don't know how to want someone this much, and still keep my judgment intact." The distance between us had somehow narrowed without either of us moving, and the rain against the glass ceiling seemed suddenly very loud and very far away. "Then stop trying to have perfect judgment," I said, "and just be honest with me instead." She reached up, slowly, and touched my jaw, her thumb tracing the line of it with a tenderness that made my breath catch. "If I kiss you right now," she said, "I don't know how to undo whatever this becomes." "I'm not asking you to undo it." I closed the last of the distance myself, and she met me halfway, and the kiss, when it came, was slow and searching and far more devastating than I'd braced myself for. Her hand sliding into my hair, mine fisting gently in the front of her coat, as if I needed something to hold on to. Rain hammered the glass above us, and somewhere in the building's dim security lights I heard a door, and we broke apart, breathless, both of us laughing quietly at how close we'd come to being discovered, though neither of us moved very far away afterward. "This complicates everything," Elara murmured against my temple. Everything was already complicated. "I need to speak to the department chair," she said, straightening, though her hand stayed at my waist. "Before anything else happens between us, I need to be removed from any grading responsibility over your coursework. I will not have you wondering, even once, whether anything between us was ever about your grades. I never thought that. I need it to be formally true Regardless, she said, and there was something fierce in it, something that told me exactly how much this mattered to her. I want you, Rowan. That is precisely why I refuse to let you ever wonder whether you were free to say no. She arranged the transfer within the week, quietly, without drawing attention, another graduate instructor taking over the grading of my remaining coursework, under the explanation of workload redistribution. It should have felt like a formality. Instead, it felt like the moment something between us became real, in a way neither of us could pretend was only investigative anymore. The following weeks held both danger and unhurried tenderness in a rhythm I hadn't known how to imagine before her. We spent an evening at my apartment surrounded by my mother's notebooks, Elara reading passages aloud in a voice gone soft with something like grief, for a woman she'd never met, and afterward she stayed later than either of us admitted was strictly necessary, my head eventually resting against her shoulder while we talked about nothing important, until the conversation dissolved into something quieter, her fingers tracing slow patterns against my arm, a kiss pressed unhurried to my temple, and later, my knuckles. Elara helped me out of a rain-soaked coat one evening, after we'd been caught in an unexpected downpour crossing the quad, offering me a dry shirt from her own closet without comment, and the domesticity of it, the easy familiarity, undid something in me more thoroughly than any of the danger had. We did not rush what came next. When it did come, it came quietly, without announcement. An evening that began with research files spread across her small apartment table and ended much later, in the soft dark, with words exchanged that neither of us had planned to say yet. And a morning after that felt tender and unguarded, in a way that told me, more than anything spoken, that whatever we were building had become something neither of us intended to let go of easily. It was 3 weeks later that Professor Graves finally moved against us, and she did it with the precision of someone who had known for a long time and had simply been waiting for the most damaging possible moment. She summoned me to her office on a Tuesday afternoon, and the room, unlike Elara's, was all glass and polished wood, deliberately designed to make visitors feel smaller. She did not raise her voice once during the entire conversation, which somehow made it more frightening than shouting would have. I understand you and my teaching assistant have developed quite an intimate research collaboration, she said, folding her hands on the desk. I also understand it has extended well beyond research. I don't know what you mean. Ms. Mercer, I built my career reading people who think they're being subtle. Let me offer you something more useful than denial. She slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a photograph, taken at an angle that made an innocent moment in the greenhouse look damning. A moment from before Elara had formally withdrawn from grading my coursework, time-stamped in a way that made the sequence of events look deliberately dishonest. This isn't what it looks like. It looks exactly like what it is, which is a graduate student in an inappropriate relationship with the teaching assistant grading her work, a relationship that could end both your scholarship and Ms. Voss's doctorate the moment it reaches the ethics board. Graves leaned back. I have no particular desire to destroy either of you. I am, however, aware that you and Ms. Voss have been examining certain archived materials related to your mother's research. My blood went cold. I knew your mother, Graves continued, almost gently. Celia was brilliant, and also profoundly naive about how institutions actually function. She believed the truth protects itself. It does not. The truth belongs to whoever has the strength and the platform to carry it, and I have spent 30 years building both. You stole her work. I refined an idea that existed as scattered fragments and gave it the rigor and platform to actually matter to the field. Your mother would have let that idea die in a drawer out of some misguided purity. I did not. She said this without a flicker of shame, as if she genuinely believed it. Here is what I am offering you, Ms. Mercer. Full institutional restoration of your mother's reputation, publicly, in my own name, crediting her as originator of the framework. In exchange, you will state, publicly if necessary, that Ms. Voss obtained and altered archive materials without authorization, acting alone, out of personal grievance against me. You want me to destroy her to save my mother. I want you to understand that one of them will bear the consequences of this investigation, and I am giving you the power to decide which, Graves said. Your mother's name, restored, permanently, in the field she loved. Or your girlfriend's doctorate, protected, at the cost of everyone believing your mother a footnote and a fraud. I left her office that day without answering, and I did not tell Elara about the offer for 4 days, ashamed that I had let myself consider it even for the length of one sleepless night, turning it over and over, while my mother's voice echoed in memory, tired and defeated, in a way I'd spent years trying to forget. Elara found out anyway, from a colleague who'd overheard Graves discussing it, and she came to my apartment that evening with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, something closed and wounded and furious all at once. "You were going to let me take the fall for this," she said, not a question. "I wasn't going to do anything. I was trying to figure out how to tell you without you doing exactly what you're doing right now. 4 days, Rowan. You've known for 4 days that she offered to sacrifice me for your mother's reputation, and you said nothing. Because I was ashamed that some small, terrified part of me actually considered it," I said, my voice cracking. "Not because I was going to do it, because I understand, better than almost anyone, what it costs to watch someone you love be erased by people who decided the truth was inconvenient. I have spent my whole life wanting my mother's name back, Elara. 4 days doesn't make me a monster. It makes me human. It makes me wonder whether I have spent months being naive in exactly the way your mother apparently was." The words hit harder than she probably intended, and I watched her realize it too late, both of us standing in my small kitchen, with everything we'd built suddenly fragile between us. "I'm not choosing my mother over you," I said quietly. "I never was. But I need you to trust me, the way you asked me to trust you in that greenhouse. Instead, you heard I was hiding something, and assumed the worst, exactly the way I feared. And now, here we are." "I need time," Elara said, and there was real pain in it, not anger anymore, just exhaustion. "I have spent years being used by people who claim to have my best interests in mind, and I do not know, right now, how to separate that history from what's happening between us." She left, and the weeks that followed were quiet and gray, in a way that felt like grief. I went through my mother's remaining notebooks alone, searching for anything that might resolve the question without costing either of us what Graves wanted taken. Priya sat with me most evenings, patient and unflinching, until one night, she finally said what I think she'd been holding back for weeks. "You're not honoring your mother by burning your own life down to prove a point," she said. "You're just proving Graves right, that the people who loved Celia never learned the difference between justice and revenge." It was near the bottom of the last notebook that I found it. A recording, an old cassette tape my mother had labeled only with a date, tucked into an envelope I'd never opened because I hadn't been able to bring myself to hear her voice again. I borrowed an old player from Priya's father and listened alone in my apartment late at night, my mother's voice filling the small room for the first time in 4 years. She spoke about her research, about the framework, about knowing, near the end, that Graves had taken credit for something she'd developed. But what struck me most was what she said near the recording's end, her voice tired but resolute. "If I spend what's left of my career trying to destroy her, I become someone I don't recognize. Truth without compassion becomes its own kind of cruelty, and I would rather my daughter remember me as someone who told the truth carefully than someone who used it as a weapon." I sat with that recording for a long time, before I understood what it meant for what I had to do next. I found Elara 3 days later, at the 24-hour library, in the same corner where we'd spent so many nights together, hunched over papers that had nothing to do with our investigation, her glasses off, her eyes tired. "I'm not choosing between you," I said, sitting down across from her without asking permission. "I found a recording of my mother. She said something I needed to hear, about truth without compassion becoming its own cruelty. I don't want my mother's reputation restored by destroying yours. I never did. I was just too afraid and too ashamed to say it clearly, and I let that silence make you doubt me, and I'm sorry." Elara was quiet for a long moment. I have spent the last 2 weeks convinced I had made the same mistake I always make, trusting someone who would eventually choose the safer, more institutionally rewarded option. I'm not going to make that choice, but I need your help finding one that doesn't require choosing at all. She looked at me then, really looked, something loosening behind her eyes. The Ethics Symposium is in 10 days. Graves is receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award. If we're going to do anything, it has to be there, publicly, where she can't simply erase the record afterward. Then let's do it together, properly, this time. No secrets. No secrets, she agreed, and reached across the table to take my hand, and something in the tightness of her grip told me we had found our way back to each other, even before either of us said it aloud. The 10 days that followed were a blur of preparation, gathering everything we had: Dr. Whitfield's signed statement, the photographed archive pages, the partial recording of Graves discussing unnecessary historical footnotes, and my mother's own recording, the clearest evidence of all, her voice describing the framework years before Graves ever claimed it. Priya helped us organize the timeline into something a room full of academics couldn't dismiss as coincidence. The symposium was held in the university's grand auditorium, faculty in formal dress, a lifetime achievement plaque waiting on a table beside the podium. Graves moved through the crowd with her usual composed authority, and when she saw Elara and me sitting together near the front, something flickered across her face, quickly smoothed away. She began her acceptance remarks with practiced warmth, speaking about the framework that had defined her career, and it was Elara who stood first, requesting, with perfect procedural correctness, a moment before the award was finalized, citing a matter of academic integrity the ethics committee was obligated to hear. Graves's expression didn't change, but her hands went still on the podium. I stood beside Elara as Dr. Whitfield arrived in person at Elara's quiet invitation, read his statement aloud, confirming he had discussed my mother's framework with her over a decade before Graves's publication. Priya played the recorded excerpt of Graves discussing historical footnotes on a small speaker, the room falling into an uncomfortable silence. And then I played my mother's recording myself, her voice steady and clear, filling the auditorium with words that had waited 11 years to be heard by anyone who mattered. Graves attempted, at first, to reframe it, suggesting parallel development, coincidental phrasing, the ordinary overlap of ideas within a shared field. But when a second faculty member in the audience, someone who had apparently worked alongside my mother decades earlier, stood to corroborate the timeline unprompted, something in the room shifted permanently. I built an institution's most celebrated framework from ideas that already existed, Graves said finally, her voice for the first time genuinely unsteady, and I do not apologize for having the strength to give them a platform your mother never had the fortitude to claim herself. She had the fortitude, I said, my own voice carrying further than I expected in the sudden hush. She had the fortitude to try to publish it honestly. What she didn't have was someone in power willing to protect her instead of erase her. Elara stepped forward then, and I watched her risk everything she had left. I have spent 4 years protecting your reputation out of fear, she told Graves, in front of the entire room. I no longer fear you. Everything in this room is verifiable, and I will confirm every piece of it to the ethics committee, regardless of what it costs me. Graves's composure finally broke, not into rage, but into something quieter and more devastating. The recognition, visible across her face, that the woman she'd spent 4 years controlling, through quiet intimidation, no longer flinched. The university opened a formal investigation within the week. It did not resolve cleanly or quickly. Graves's Lifetime Achievement Award was suspended pending review. My mother's case was reopened. Her name entered back into academic record with an asterisk that would, eventually, become a full correction. My scholarship, initially threatened by the discovery of my relationship with Elara, was protected once the committee understood the full context, that Elara had withdrawn from grading my work well before anything romantic began, and that the photograph Graves had used was deliberately mistimed to imply otherwise. Elara's doctorate survived, but not without cost. She spent months in meetings with an ethics board still deciding how much of the archive access, unauthorized as it technically was, could be excused given what it had ultimately exposed. In the end, she transferred her doctoral research to an independent ethics foundation, partnered loosely with the university, finishing her degree honestly, without Graves's shadow over any of it, though it meant starting significant portions of her research again from the beginning. We spent a strange, quiet stretch of months partly apart during that period, both of us rebuilding what the investigation had cost us. Elara traveling twice to the Foundation's offices for weeks at a time, me finishing my remaining coursework under an instructor who had nothing to do with any of it. We spoke often, met when we could, but we did not simply fall back into each other out of habit or relief. There was an afternoon, midway through that stretch, when Elara came back from a 2-week stint at the Foundation, looking thinner than I remembered, the strain of rebuilding her research from scratch visible in the set of her shoulders. We met at the same 24-hour library corner out of old habit, though neither of us had brought any archive material this time, just ourselves, and the quiet, unfamiliar business of learning how to be together without a crisis organizing every conversation. "I don't know how to do this part," she admitted, turning a coffee cup slowly between her hands. "I know how to investigate. I know how to argue a position and defend evidence, and outlast someone smarter and more powerful than I am. I don't know how to simply sit across from you with nothing to solve." "You're doing it right now," I said. "It doesn't have to be more complicated than this. It terrifies me more than the greenhouse did, more than the lodge, more than Graves." She looked up at me, something raw and unguarded in her expression that I still wasn't used to, even after everything. There was no evidence trail that could tell me whether this would work. I have never been good at things I can't verify in advance. "Some things you only verify by doing them," I said, and reached across the table for her hand, and she let me take it, her fingers curling slowly around mine, the way they had that first time on the train. Except there was no danger organizing the moment now, just two people choosing, quietly, to keep choosing each other. Priya, when I told her about that conversation, rolled her eyes with real affection. "You two turned falling in love into a research methodology. I'm almost impressed." "It's not a methodology. It is a little bit a methodology," she said. "But for what it's worth, I've never seen you steadier than you've been these last few months. Whatever the process is, it's working." The Ethics Board's final report, when it came, months later than any of us expected, ran to nearly 200 pages, cataloging every irregularity Graves had introduced into her framework's provenance, every pressure she had quietly applied to junior faculty and graduate students across more than a decade to keep her position secure. It did not restore everything perfectly. My mother's name was entered back into the academic record with careful, formal language that could never fully account for the years she had spent believing herself discredited and alone. But it was there, permanent now, undeniable, cited correctly for the first time in a published addendum that would follow her original framework into every future syllabus. Elara's doctoral committee, once the investigation concluded, offered a formal apology for the years she had spent protecting a mentor who had never once protected her in return, though apologies, we both knew, rebuilt very little on their own. What rebuilt things was the slow, unglamorous work that followed. Her research reconstructed at the Independent Foundation, my consent advocacy proposal, moving through committee after committee until it was finally approved, each of us learning, separately and then together, how to build something honest out of what had nearly been destroyed. When we chose each other again, fully, it was a deliberate choice, made with clear eyes, neither of us pretending the danger hadn't been real or that the cost had been small. Nearly a year after that Tuesday afternoon exam, I stood once more outside the same third-floor office where this had all begun, except the room had been reassigned, repurposed as the administrative office for a new student research consent advocacy program the university had approved in the wake of the investigation, one I had helped design, named in part for my mother. The overhead light was on this time, warm and steady, no storm outside to dim anything. On the wall near the small desk hung a framed copy of my old exam, the one with the red circle and the 4 words that had started everything. Beneath Elara's original note, in the same careful, slanted hand, was a second line, added more recently. "I am no longer afraid of being seen by you. I hope you'll let me keep choosing you, every ordinary day, for as long as you'll have me." Elara was waiting by the window when I turned around, no longer the guarded, unreachable woman my classmates had once described, though still composed, still precise, still entirely herself. "You framed it," I said. "I wanted you to walk into this room and remember it as something other than fear," she said. Come home with me tonight, not because anything is being decided or resolved, just because I would like to make you dinner, and fall asleep beside you, and do it again tomorrow, and the day after that. That's a very unromantic way to ask someone to build a life with you. I've never claimed to be romantic in the conventional sense, she said, though the corner of her mouth was doing that soft, reluctant thing it did only for me. I am, however, remarkably consistent. I intend to keep choosing you, quietly, every day, for as long as you'll allow it. I crossed the room, past the framed exam, past the ordinary warm light of an office that no longer needed to hide behind dimmed lamps or locked doors, and kissed her slowly, unhurried, the kind of kiss that didn't need a storm outside to make it feel like something worth remembering. When we finally broke apart, she rested her forehead against mine, and for the first time since that terrifying, electric Tuesday, nearly a year ago, I felt entirely, unguardedly safe. Yes, I said, I'll come home with you, tonight, and tomorrow, and however many ordinary days come after that. Good, she said quietly. That's exactly the note I was hoping you'd write back.